information, especially for students who have certain, I guess you say, like characteristics, like they're bilingual or they're low income or, you know, whatever certain restrictions might be because of their school system, because of the way their school works, what that school provides, how they can get assistance outside the classroom.
And that's a really important thing, and I'm actually mentioning a few of the out-of-school things in my talk, and I'm really, really interested to hear more. Okay, what else? So we have some experiential learning, we have experience teaching. Does anyone just think education is cool and you showed up just because? Okay, I'm hoping. I know that was not a very well-articulated reason, but again, I really appreciate you all being here. And so my thought process for this talk really began at 9:01 p.m. on a lonely night. I'm making up the lonely part, it makes it sound more dramatic. With the rain and the thunder and the rest of that. Well, I'm from Seattle, so that part is real, unfortunately. And I was sitting at my computer, and as I always do, I was stalking some of my friends on Facebook. And I was looking at this photo, and there's a bunch of them. They're in this very formal setting. It's a wood-paneled building with a clock on the wall, and they all look really happy. They have arms around each other. It's a pretty small group. I recognize a lot of them. They have these big smiles on their faces, and they look joyful, indeed almost joyfully smug. And what they're at is a reception. It's a commendation from the school district because they're National Merit Scholars. So some of you might recognize this scene. Maybe some of you were even in that sort of scene. And I looked at this picture, and I started thinking. I started thinking about all the schools a few of them had already been accepted to, all the prestigious competitions many of them have already won, and the scholarships they'll receive, and thought they're so happy not just because they're winning this or because they've done well here, it's because they've done well most everywhere and because they will continue to do well. They stand on the precipice of taking control of their lives, and in that moment, they're really owning it. But let's backtrack a little bit and ask, as I did at 9:01 p.m. that lonely, stormy night, how did they get there? Well, it all began when they were around 6 years old, or 12 years old. And on one day when they were a little bit more stressed out about going to school than usual because their parents told them this is a really important test, they took a test that placed them in the top percentile of students in our school district and made them eligible for the district's Exalted Gifted program. So when they entered high school after this gifted program, they entered with a knowledge base that was a grade higher than most of their general ed counterparts, and they slid easily into honors and AP courses because of that, like they were born for them. They took 6 or 7 AP classes a year and scored 5s on all the tests, and they made straight A's. And on a day in October in 11th grade, they went to school with a little more nervousness than usual, and they took another test, this one national, the PSAT, and they did well. Their story is the story of a large and very privileged class of teenagers around the nation. It's the story of students who knew what hoops they had to jump through and jumped through them easily and well, with a choreography that would make Olympians jealous. I used to believe, when I was more idealistic, when I was a 9th grader, that these people earned these high scores and perfect grades and joyful smiles on a day like that because they were the hardest working, because they were the best, that merit meant merit. And today I wonder, even as much as I love those people, because the majority of them are my good friends, I wonder if we overestimate what testing can tell us about any given person's qualifications for the best schools, the best jobs, the best scholarships, and the best lives. I wonder if we have fallen too deeply in love with the idea of merit that we can quantify. And most importantly, I wonder what we can do to change that, how we can make education better through true partnerships between students and educators and an entrepreneurial mindset that brings fresh ideas to the education reform discussion so it's no longer this top-down approach where it's only government leaders who are dictating what changes must happen en masse across schools, but more people coming up with ideas that can then spread throughout communities. So my hope is that today you're going to walk away with the idea that merit needs to be expanded beyond an idea of mere smartness. And it needs to include the many areas of excellence that represent the diversity of a given population and the diversity of needs in an economy. I'm proposing 3 different ways, things that I've seen that have already been really successful in schools that I've visited or heard about, which is that we can embrace student voice in education reform, something I'm deeply passionate about because I'm speaking here after all. That we can allow students more opportunity for independent, passion-driven learning, and that we can also offer more variety in the courses and tracks that are offered and the ones that are thought of as good enough for all students, so that those are offered to students from all socioeconomic backgrounds. So I began by talking about my friends who are the National Merit Scholars and how they got there with the test. Well, they're not the only ones who take a lot of tests. For most of us, probably some of you remember pretty well in high school what tests you took, which ones you did well on. And by the time I graduate, I'll have not only taken the standardized state tests in many subjects, but also 10 APs, 3 SATs, and 2 SAT subject tests. And that's like low compared to a lot of people I know. I think one person has taken, that I know has taken like 15 APs. This is something that begins really early. And actually, yeah, one was saying, oh, I want to challenge myself to take every single AP science and then cross off the other ones as I go through. And I was just like, dang. In many districts, students will take adaptive assessments to help drive data-driven practices. Now, I paused and I thought, that's a mumbo-jumbo of words that your average student, not to mention your average parent or your average community member who's interested in education will not understand. You really have to break that down, but most school districts don't take the time to do that. Testing, I think, sorts learners into this really false binary of successes and failures. And I remember one time a friend who had done kind of badly on her test recently had posted on Facebook, I don't understand why it is that we think of a C as such a failure. I think of it as learning the majority of information. When you think about it as 3/4, I learned most of what I was supposed to learn, and yet you get less than an 80%, and some places you get less than a 90%, and you're thought of as someone who isn't smart enough, isn't good enough, didn't learn or study well enough. And another thing is that no test can truly be an accurate snapshot of someone as complex and varied and beautiful as a person who walks into your classroom. Some of you are planning on becoming teachers. Because of testing culture, we've shifted focus from, I think, that which can be learned to that which can be trotted out and performed on a test. Take a moment to think about some of the most valuable lessons you've learned in your life. And now try to phrase that in a neat, succinct question that has A through E answers. It is very, very difficult for me to do that with any of the lessons I have learned that are important in my life. You can give a student something that says, which of these is the moral decision to make in this situation, A through E, and that doesn't allow them to justify it, it doesn't allow them to do anything more with that, and it might not even have one right answer. I think some of the most important things in life don't. So, unfortunately, what this does, this reliance on only learning the things that can be trotted out and performed, it cuts out a lot of really important learning, not only ethical learning or artistic learning, but pretty much any learning that isn't easy to reduce. And I think that this makes students automatically associate test taking with learning, as if those two are equivalent. And many students, because of that, come to rely on the test tomorrow as their sole motivation for learning something, particularly if it's 12 a.m. on a Wednesday night. And I think that this erodes our intrinsic motivation and our natural desire to learn. Think back to a long moment ago, maybe when you were 3 years old or 4 years old and you were just putting stuff in your mouth and you were asking questions. Think especially about that part, asking questions. Think of all the questions you asked in a given day when you were really, really little. I asked a lot of questions. I asked, why is the sky blue and why are leaves green? And a lot more questions than I would ask today because I know that the answers will be long and rather scientific. But I think that curiosity is incredibly innate. And contrary to popular belief, events with high stakes, like testing, are not the best ways to motivate people. It seems weird. It seems like if I offered you $100 that you would do the task with a reward better. But the best-selling author Dan Pink, who has given many a speech on this topic, says that actually what he calls non-commissioned work, or the work that you don't get a reward for, or a disincentive for performing badly, that uncommissioned uncommissioned work is performed much better. And he gives the example in particular of products that have come out of companies like Google and FedEx during the time that they give employees paid, but that is essentially free time to innovate. So I know that Google actually recently took out its 20% time from most employees, but when they have that in place, then people came up with things like Gmail and Google Maps, products that probably all of us use at some point. And that was on someone's time that they weren't really, that wasn't really their job, which is incredible to me. So the fact that they came up with things that were more innovative and more profitable for the company ultimately when they weren't doing their job, says that we're more productive when we enjoy our work. And the same is true for students. I think I speak for the majority when I say that bubbling in a Scantron is not anyone's idea of a fun experience. There are better ways to assess. I know that a lot of criticism, I know, super meta, right? Of testing has been, well, what alternatives are you giving? There are alternatives that work well. Admittedly, they require more labor from teachers and perhaps a deeper understanding of students, but I think that that's ultimately a good thing and something we should strive for in education. I had the chance to run right up in one of those alternatives this year. As a senior at my high school, I had the chance to take a pilot program, basically, of a 3-period, yes, a gigantic block class called Global Health. It was modeled after a freshman global health class at University of Washington, so we read a lot more scholarly papers and write more in-depth papers than most other students do. One of the great things about global health is that I can't remember the last time we had a bubble-in test. As in, it's pretty normal to go 2 or 3 months without taking a test that is anything reminiscent of an A through E AP-style test. Instead, we do problem-based learning assessments, which is where we're presented with a problem. For instance, a lack of rural access in Afghanistan to clean water, and we have to come up with a proposal that makes sense, is cost-effective, and is better, arguably, than our classmates, so it's competition, and it's also thinking of our own solutions. So in the case of that one, we had to conduct experiments with various different things. We used Pure, which is basically just adding chlorine to water and filtering it, versus Life Straw. There were some other options as well, just straining it through paper filters, etc. And then we ran cost-benefit analyses of these different options, and we did a presentation. Now, to me, that is a lot harder, in all honesty, than preparing for any kind of test that I've ever done in AP Bio. But it was also more fun, and I felt more willing to put my time into it, which is something that we should all strive for when we're teaching students, to create things that they're willing to put their time into and that actually make sense. I would do that all over again, and I felt like it was a fair way to be assessed, because it was actually me starting at the same point basically as everyone else, not really knowing which one of these filters would work better and having to do research and start from the ground up. So to me, that's a much better way to assess. At some point, the kinds of tests that you and I are used to, those A through E bubble-in ones, become really dehumanizing. Dehumanizing because they strip away that most basic of human characteristics, the one that we start with when we're babies chewing everything, which is curiosity. And I think that when it comes to curiosity, I hit rock bottom in mid-October. So I had this 100-point AP Bio test, and I was like, oh, this is going to make or break my grade, which will make or break my future, etc. It's not a good line of reasoning, clearly. And I think that a lot of students go through that, especially when it's your first semester, senior year, mid-year grade reports and everything. So the night before, I was just glowering at my study packet, and it was about photosynthesis. I was at this point thinking, okay, plants and all my food can go to hell. I just really don't want to know about photosynthesis, because I was so angry, and it created this immense animosity. And my dad walks in at the wrong time. And he says, oh, photosynthesis, yay! Do you know about the isotopes involved? And I'm like, if it is not on the test, I do not care. And the moment I said those words out loud, I knew something had died deep within me. I knew something had died because I was never that girl who raised my hand and said, is this going to be on the test tomorrow? I was never the girl who on Friday nights had a date with my sexy pile of flashcards. I was never that girl. And my parents were not tiger parents who pressured me to achieve all A's. Sometimes I wish they had. When I was filling out college apps, every fiber of me wished that for 4 years I had had my very own rent-a-tiger parent. And if that's not a service, I'm sure someone will come up with it. I wish that I had parents who had shuttled me to SAT prep classes instead of just giving me the $5 I needed to buy a used book from a friend. I wished that I had had parents who told me I needed to do math classes over the summer and enrichment classes instead of parents who accepted that I was simply going to do Algebra 2. Yes, Algebra 2 while my friends did AP Calc. Parents who had said no more absences from school instead of letting me jet around to 15 countries and 27 states, speaking at conferences where I learned more in some weeks than I had learned in years of school. Or wait, did I really want those alternate universe parents? And not just because my mom is sitting right there, I'm really glad that I had the parents I had. That I had parents who were either brave enough to reject or clueless enough not to know what it would take in these days of high-stakes testing and really cutthroat competition where the majority of my friends are national merit scholars to get into the most prestigious colleges. And I'm really glad that I had parents who never ordered me to stop reading all these books that I had checked out from the library. Most recently, I went on a spree and got 17 at once. so that I could study for upcoming tests. Yes, I chose to read a giant book about zoonotic diseases instead of legitimately studying for certain AP bio tests. Did I learn more about biology through those books? Yes, sometimes I did. Well, my parents were brave or clueless, but I wasn't. Most school days provide me with some of the hardest fights in my life, where I have to decide between my innate desire to learn something crazy and out of the box, out of curiosity, to read a giant book about rabies, versus my desire to learn for someone else's ranking and prepare for tests coming up. The pressure of passing one test or another just kind of sits in the back of your mind, especially if it's coming up in a few weeks, and it slowly rises like a fever as it gets closer and closer. And if it were a disease on WebMD, one of the symptoms that would be listed, aside from death, because WebMD exaggerates everything, it would be tunnel vision. Because when you have that test coming up, then suddenly everything becomes all about the test, and anything that isn't helpful gets thrown out to the side, just like those poor isotopes and photosynthesis that my dad wanted to tell me about. Testing creates a narrow focus that excludes discussion, it excludes finishing books on a personal reading list, and for many students excludes what they might be independently interested in. So my question is, why are we nationally moving toward more testing that determines how much extra funding schools get, that determines whether they're passing standards, and much more? Well, not only does it allow for politicians to point to greater accountability, it also benefits a large and very powerful industry. And PBS first pointed out this educational industrial complex after No Child Left Behind, and they pointed out that 3 testing companies basically have a grip on all the millions, hundreds of millions of dollars actually being allotted by the federal government for standardized testing. In this article, they mentioned that according to an October 2001 report, Harcourt, CTV, McGraw-Hill, and Riverside Publishing write 96% of the exams administered at the state level. So 3 companies write 96% of the exams. And NCS Pearson is the leading scorer of standardized tests. Testing is an industry that just keeps on growing. While test sales in 1955 were $7 million, and that's adjusted to 1998 dollars, that figure was $263 million in 1997. That's an increase of more than 3,000%. 3,000% from 1955 to 1997, which is the year that I was born, and between 1997 to today, I'm sure that that number has only grown larger. To me, there's something wrong with that. There's something wrong with the fact that corporations have quietly woven themselves into the fabric of what to many people makes the tapestry of the modern public education system, testing. Diane Ravitch, the Secretary of Education, the former Secretary of Education, who is now really vehemently anti the expansion of standardized testing, wrote a book recently, and an author from The Nation wrote in a review, "The mission of public schools should not be to make money," she insists. "Required to educate all citizens, public schools embody hard-won principles of equity and inclusion that are now in danger. The free market always favors those with more money and information, generating inequality. Ravitch says that purported free market solutions have worked as distractions from the truly pressing problems of poverty and segregation by race and class, which impede learning and therefore should be the actual target of education and social reform." That we're distracted from these truly pressing issues of poverty and segregation by race and class is unsurprising considering our current interpretation of merit. Instead of truly rewarding hard work, what happens more often than not is accidentally perpetuating long-held inequalities along socioeconomic, geographic, and racial lines. A great example comes from Hunter College High School in New York City, which is an elite public school, and it uses a test every year to select its entering class. So in many ways, to a lot of people, Hunter College High School is one of the last high schools in the United States that is truly meritocracy, because you get a high enough score on the test, you're in regardless of how much money your parents make or what race you are, right? But some years back, the faculty chose Hudson, a student headed to Columbia University to give the valedictorian address. And after the really standard things you say in a valedictorian address, and how sad you are to leave, and how great all the fellow students are, etc., I've seen a couple, so I'm a little cynical, then he said something incredibly shocking, the type of thing you do not hear in valedictorian addresses very often. He said, "More than happiness, relief, fear, or sadness, I feel guilty. I feel guilty because I don't deserve any of this, and neither do any of you. We received an outstanding education at no charge based solely on our performance on a test we took when we were 11-year-olds or 4-year-olds. We received superior teachers and additional resources based on our status as gifted, while kids who naturally needed those resources more than us wallowed in the mire of a broken system. And now we stand on the precipice of our lives, in control of our lives, based purely and simply on luck and circumstance. If you truly believe that the demographics at Hunter represent the distribution of intelligence in this city, then you must believe that the Upper West Side, Bayside, and Flushing are intrinsically more intelligent than the South Bronx, Bedford-Stuyvesant, and Washington Heights, and I refuse to accept that. We are talking about 11-year-olds. We are talking about deciding children's fates before they even had a chance. We are playing God and we are losing. Kids are losing the opportunity to go to college or obtain a career because no one taught them long division or colors. Hunter is perpetuating a system in which children who contain unbridled and untapped intellect and creativity are discarded like refuse. And we have the audacity to say they deserved it because we're smarter than them. So he received a standing ovation from his teachers, although the president of Hunter College, who was herself a Hunter College High School, who was herself a graduate, remained seated. And I found the story of his valedictorian address really, in some ways, inspiring, because it was someone who had personally benefited from the system who was actually then criticizing it. And I think that many of us are in the position that he is in, where we may have benefited from a system of testing and of doing well on those tests, but we have the ethical necessity of really taking a hard look at that and asking if that benefit was fair. I was surprised to learn that the word meritocracy first entered the popular lexicon because of a British member of Parliament, Michael Young, who wrote a book called The Rise of the Meritocracy in 1958, so really recent actually. It described a new British social system, the meritocracy, and he wrote about how this meritocracy would create a new elite by testing all the children and printing the score on their identity cards, and then it would segregate them, putting the really smart kids in the best schools with the best resources. It sounds familiar because with the exception of printing scores on identity cards, we do that. We test kids. We do it at schools in New York. We do it with entrance exams for gifted and talented programs in middle schools in my home district. In reading about Michael Young's vision, I was really reminded of the QUEST program, which is the gifted and talented program in my home district, the one that students stress out about in elementary and middle school, trying to figure out if they're in or not. Once they're in, they're part of an extraordinarily insular community. They're called Questies, and they mostly stick together. Even in high school, after Quest is done, their friend groups have solidified, mainly around being in that program because they took the majority of their classes over 8 years with the exact same people. And I've heard this unfortunate dichotomy, which is created in the minds of a few people in Quest, that somehow the Quest kids are smart and Gen Ed kids are stupid. As in, I have actually heard I had to ride the bus with the stupid kids, meaning Gen Ed. That, to me, is the exact kind of segregation by race and class that I heard Diane Ravitch mention, because if you look at the demographics of the kids in Quest and you look at the demographics of regular, of Gen Ed kids, then it's very much segregated. Like, you do not see African American students in Quest. You do not see Hispanic students in Quest. And you mainly see students whose parents work at Microsoft, whose parents work at Amazon or Google or any of the other high-tech companies in Microsoft. There are a lot of kids whose parents are immigrants, but it's not because their parents are immigrants, to be a bit contrary to Amy Traw, it's because their parents were very well educated at home and have high-paying jobs now in the US. And I look at the demographics of Quest versus the demographics of Gen Ed, and I find that to be wrong on many levels. To go back to Michael Young's book, The Rise of the Meritocracy, here's the kicker. Michael Young, when he was writing about what Britain could be with this meritocracy, he wasn't setting out to create an ideal, he wasn't writing about anything good. He said the book was a dystopia. A dystopia, like 1984. His book, he said in 2001, was a satire meant to be a warning. And that's how meritocracy got into the American vocabulary. Clearly, we did not get the memo that it was a dystopia. Our society runs on the hubris of believing that we have the science of quantifying merit down to this art that we can approach with district-wide assessments and state tests and the SAT and PSAT and AP tests and all the rest. If someone does well in the PSAT in 11th grade, they become a national merit scholar. But that's such a misnomer because the idea that merit can be found on a multiple choice test is really imperfect. There are too many ways to game the system, and too many people who have everything to win if they do. You win if your parents have more financial means by going to a private school or a public school that has the ability to hire more qualified teachers because it's in a good neighborhood that has better property taxes. Later on, you can get everything that money can buy with brand spanking new books and SAT prep classes, tutors, and if you need to, taking a test over and over and over again. Like, I have friends who've taken the SAT 6 times, which to me just does not look good at a certain point, but I have to say that if you are a student who doesn't have the financial means to maybe pay up $50 again and again, you might ask a counselor for a fee waiver, right? But a counselor who's working with maybe 500 students in an urban school has limited resources to meet with you, and you might not be able to provide the exhaustive documentation of your family's financial situation. So that's a tremendous inequality right there. And in all honesty, I took the SAT 3 times, because the lackluster 540 out of 800 that I got in math the first time, as I said to my parents weekly afterwards, at least it's not an F percentage-wise, was just not good enough, and I took online pre-calculus over the summer. It was the cheapest course I could find, because Asian genes. Okay, that was racist, sorry. But even so, I knew that many students with parents who were struggling to find work or barely making ends meet could never afford the monthly fee that I paid for that online pre-calc course. So I scored 100 points higher the next time I took the test, and it was not because I got that much better at math or because I had been I don't know, because I'd had a bad day previously or something. It was because I had a lot of help. And the people I know whose parents are well off even have better incentives to score higher. Get a 2350 and we'll get you a car, said one of my friend's parents. That's not the kind of incentive that a kid in an urban school with a single mom working 2 jobs could ever hope to get for scoring better on the SAT. You win if you're a teacher, a principal, or a superintendent with no scruples who can earn accolades or more money for your district by raising test scores. And you don't necessarily do that by educating students better. You might do it by literally getting together with a bunch of teachers in a room and erasing students' wrong answers so that you have improved test scores and an improved school district. That actually happened in Georgia, where the school district superintendent may go to jail because of her role in a cheating scandal that was so widespread that the teachers actually had pizza parties, like they would bring pizza into the rooms where they were correcting these tests. And the superintendent was lauded, before she was obviously arrested, for her role in improving a school district and turning around the schools. And it was this bright illusion created by cheating. Now the true scandal to me, though, is less about the number of teachers who are involved or the amount of cheating that went on, and more about the idea that tests were our sole measure of whether these schools were doing okay. How much work does it take to actually go into a school and know the students and see their progress instead of only relying on a single snapshot that you get from one day? A school can produce the most shiny and gleaming of A's and B's on its standardized tests and still be rotten at its core, with stressed out students who don't care about learning for the sake of learning but just regurgitate information, and teachers and staff who feel pressured to narrow their curriculum so that they get it down to the bare bones of what's going to be tested, and a lack of a cohesive school community that celebrates all kinds of merit, including those that don't get tested, merit in the arts and the sciences or entrepreneurship. So, what's more, these tests don't really mean if you're smart or not. They test how well you can memorize material determined important by standards that are arbitrary and change. It used to be that being a meritorious scholar meant that you could rattle off works of art in the Western world. You knew Latin and Greek like the back of your hand, and maybe French or German or Spanish. Today, being a meritorious scholar means high scores on critical reading, writing, and mathematics, and good grades. But it's the heart-wrenching decision between whether a passage's tone is bellicose or indignant. I still don't know if I got that right. Is that really a reflection of if I'm smart, or if anyone is smart? And the 800 on reading, that felt so easy to me. It wasn't because I was smart, it was because I grew up in a household that used a lot of big words, and my parents bought me a ton of books. How can you account for all that? How can you make up for the lost time in some kids' life not hearing big words, not reading books that their parents had the money to buy? How can you account for that? How can you account for the inequality of advantages in someone's life in determining whether or not a kid is smart or not? I don't think that we can fool ourselves into determining that we can determine merit with a test score because of all those differences. To emphasize the pervasive falsehood that we know what it means to be meritorious because of how someone does on a test that supposedly measures smartness, it also does something else. It creates a pervasive attitude that makes intelligence its highest virtue, to quote the author Christopher Hayes. He goes on to say, quote, "Intelligence is a vitally necessary characteristic for those with powerful positions, but it isn't just a celebration of smartness that characterizes the culture of meritocracy, it's something more pernicious. conviction that smartness is rankable and that the hierarchy of intelligence, like the hierarchy of wealth, never plateaus. Smartness is necessary, but it is far from sufficient. Wisdom, judgment, empathy, and ethical rigor are all as important, even if those traits are far less valued because we don't test them. Indeed, extreme intelligence without these qualities can be extremely destructive. But empathy does not impress the same way smartness does. Smartness dazzles and mesmerizes, end quote. Many people will say that school is supposed to be preparation for society, and society hands working adults the business equivalents of Scantrons and SATs. It hands adults competitions and ranking systems at companies like JP Morgan, where people who rank in the bottom 10% are automatically fired. Life, many people say, is a rat race. Personally, I think that we build what we want our society to be within our schools. And because of that, I want a school that doesn't hand me a rat race. Because I want a society that values me as more than a class rank, a score, or a percentile. So, I've talked a lot about some of the problems, and now the question is, how can we fix it? How can we go into schools with the mindset of solving problems? Well, we need three things, and these solutions have already been implemented in some schools. One, we need a student perspective in education reform that is true and authentic, because a lot of lip service is paid to listening to students, but very rarely does it actually occur in a grand scale beyond, oh, let's let the ASB or student council plan a dance. Secondly, we need greater independence for students in their learning, so that passion can really drive what students are learning, whether it's in school or out of school. And three, we need more variety offered in high school when it comes to the courses and tracks offered, so that every student can realize they have merit somewhere, regardless of how well or badly they did on the SAT. First, embracing the student perspective in education reform. The kinds of criticisms that we need to hear, criticizing the ways we measure merit, that they aren't going to come from politicians who like the accountability and the easy answers that testing provide. And they aren't going to come from parents who may not be equipped with the tools to be involved in the education reform discussion, including parents of kids who are most marginalized by high-stakes testing. It's going to come most authentically and most urgently from students like me who are quite honestly sick of spending hours and hours taking tests. That's why I'm a huge advocate of class and school and district level solicitation of student voice. In January, I was actually in Michigan, where it was freezing cold, -6 degrees, and I had the chance to speak to an audience of 500 superintendents and principals. What was really cool was that afterwards I had the chance to be on a panel of entirely students who came from a nearby school, and it was the first time they had ever been invited on a stage to tell leaders in the school district about their educational experience. But I think it's a shame that it was the first time, because that's the kind of opportunity that every single student should have at some point in their educational career, to be able to tell their school district's leaders what they think and what they're genuinely experiencing, whether they're straight A students or athletes or in special ed. Student voice needs to be democratic. And the idea of giving all students a stage of sorts is exactly what the hashtag #StuVoice movement does. Don't discount it just because it starts with a hashtag. It's seriously pretty cool. If any of, who's on Twitter? See some raised hands? Sweet. Okay, so you can join in on Mondays. There's a Twitter chat, or check it out. And it's actually really cool. It was started by University of Maryland student Zach Muhammad, and he's super passionate about education. It's gotten so large that hashtag #StuVoice is now a trending topic, or it has been a trending topic on Twitter in the past. It often does become one on Mondays. Secretary of Education Arnie Duncan joined in recently, and one student who's frequently on the #StuVoice Twitter chat said, the Secretary of Education is on this, that's so dope. And Secretary Duncan responded, yes, it is pretty dope. So that's one thing that we need. We need authentic student voices, because the best and the most authentic criticisms of testing culture and of our limited ways of defining merit are going to come directly from students. What's more, we need independence in learning. At Monument Mountain High School in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, there's a handful of teens in a room who are conducting something called the Independent Project. So it started with a student named Sam Levin, who decided that he wanted to make learning more than just a bunch of AP classes. So he started a school within a school program that he got approved by administration. And the idea was that all these students first semester, instead of taking regular courses, they would get together and they would spend half of the day on a major independent endeavor. So it could be something like learning the piano, writing a novel, whatever else. And they would spend half the day on inquiry-based learning in the natural and social sciences. In addition, the entire group would take on a social project with significance for the community. So the questions that the students addressed ranged from things like, is there science behind old wives' tales, to why do we cry, to how do mice react to aromatherapy, the one I personally found most interesting. And they read more books in 8 weeks than the AP Lang class in their high school read in a given year. Then what's more, they loved it. The students came from all across the academic spectrum. There were no prerequisites, no co-requisites. They included special ed and straight A students. They started transforming the spare room in their school into a home base for learning. They brought in shelves and books, and there was actually a documentary made about the independent project with almost 30,000 views on YouTube. And their new goal is to make it scalable, so that other schools will start thinking about implementing the independent project there. Sam Levin, the student who began it, is now at the University of Oxford, and the continuation of the program has been assured by faculty and underclassmen at his school, so it's something that is really continuing. A Williams College psychology professor, Susan Engel, said that she thought it was the only way to radically change high school education in this country, to make kids feel in charge of their own education, to make them not just the recipients, but the authors of their own educational experience. I think we have nothing more empowering as a student in high school than to be in charge to some extent of my own education, and that was exactly what those students had. The power of the independent project is best summarized by the Antoine Saint-Exupéry quote at the beginning of a 15-minute documentary about the project. Quote, "If you want to build a ship, don't drum up the men to gather wood, divide the work, and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea." I want this to be what education does, and I want this to be what education is. Not the 4 years that prepare me for tests, but the 4 years that make me fall in love with learning, or perhaps don't make me fall out of love with it in the first place. The third thing we need to that point is variety. I agree with Diane Ravitch on the idea that public schools have an obligation to produce a full, rounded, and liberal education, similar to the kind of education that you all are receiving. That idea is clearly realized with pursuits like the Independent Project, or schools like Bard College Early High School in New York, where one student, Sam, said, "The day that the course catalog comes out at my school is like Christmas morning. My friends and I run through the hall, frantically circling all of the classes that we want to take. Instead of worrying about choosing between AP Government and AP English, we're excited to see that novels of Fyodor Dostoevsky and a political science course called Equality are being offered." During the last 2 years of high school, I was able to choose from a plethora of on-site college courses taught by college professors. BHSEC also emphasizes discussion rather than lecture and expects that students will develop critical thinking tools by challenging one another's ideas. We need a significant shift away from investing in students' test scores and toward funding programs that challenge students to critically think. Discussing notions of Lockean consent with a professor who had just published a book on religious toleration was exponentially more valuable to me than learning how to answer a question on an AP or Regents exam. Learning how to build an argument by examining contradicting viewpoints meant more to me than constructing a 5-paragraph essay. All of the students, teachers, and parents in my school also embrace a love for learning beyond exam scores and report cards. I have frequently had conversations about Kafka with friends over peanut butter and jelly sandwiches at lunch. That is exactly the kind of school that I dreamed about when I was little. That was what I thought high school was going to be. I thought that it would be a place where people really, really enjoyed learning and got together and had intellectual conversations every minute they could. And so I think that variety is something that is often lost when we focus only on the things that are tested, reading and math, and if you're taking the ACT, then science. We really have to focus on, or not focus, I suppose. We have to expand our focus and think about the value of variety. And I mean variety in a true sense, not only in the number of academic courses that are offered, things like Equality and novels of Fyodor Dostoevsky, but also meaning that educational institutions can house arts learning and trade learning, where students can be excellent at the sciences, dance, or become culinary geniuses. In Des Moines, Iowa, they have a place called Central Campus, which houses a magnet school for those who are academically focused, as well as career-focused options for people interested in everything from education to transportation. If any of you subscribe to Time magazine, you notice that the recent cover story focused on a high school that gave students a tech-focused education, and they actually had guaranteed jobs and paid internships at IBM after that. The students said that they were motivated by the connection to industry and the real-world context of their learning. However, one thing that I noticed when my mom pointed out all the pictures illustrating that story were that the students were almost universally African-American, and according to the article, they mostly came from low-income brackets. This to me is a shame because I, as a half-Asian girl from a place where most of my friends work for Microsoft or Google or Amazon, I am not less suited for vocational education or for something that is career focused, and those options should not be thought of as less good for me simply because of who I am or where I come from. And by that same token, those students should have equal opportunities to advance as far as they want to academically. What I think needs to happen is that there should be nothing stigmatizing or segregating about an education that focuses on real-world components as much as it does on academics. I know that many of my friends who are headed off to really prestigious colleges would have also benefited from having a connection to industry or more real-world connections within their education. So when we talk about variety, we need to think about how it's more than just offering cooler and better and well-taught writing and science and math courses. It's also about offering things like education and transportation and even construction. Because the truth is that if we create two classes of people who only have experience in one or the other thing, and that line is often drawn because of how much money their parents make or what zip code they're in or what color their skin is, then we're not really doing a service when it comes to variety, and we're not doing a service when it comes to social justice. As Diane Ravitch said, the priority that we have to address is poverty and segregation by race and class. Student voice affecting decisions on how we change schools, independence in learning, and variety in the courses and tracks offered to students of all socioeconomic backgrounds may not seem like direct challenges to high-stakes tests, because in truth they're not. Instead, they challenge something far deeper, which is the underlying idea that merit is a singular score. Student voice, independence, and variety help to promote the idea that the strength of a society comes from the diversity of ways in which we define merit and reward it. No economy of diverse individuals can flourish if we don't find merit in wider expressions of excellence beyond smartness in academics. And as we learn to recognize and reward the value of a broader spectrum of human talents and skills, we in turn expand, advance, and diversify our financial systems, the richness of our shared way of life, and the quality of our existence. It starts with us, and I believe we can do it. Thank you. If not, then I can ask you all some questions as well. Oh, yeah?
Sure. First, thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts with us. We talked about a lot of things, right? Let's grant that PS1 should be, have as many high-quality teachers as Hunter. And let's grant that courses should be richer in curriculum. Given that, do you think there is a place for testing to evaluate whether students have mastered material?
I think that there's sometimes a place for testing. Yeah, I mean, like in the example that I gave in my global health classroom, I just said that the assessment isn't like it doesn't rely on Scantron, it doesn't rely on like the A through E type testing. I think that testing does happen in life in all kinds of situations, but the kind of testing that I personally want to see as a student is testing that actually motivates me based on the content versus based on the, I guess the like reward or disincentive. So less high stakes and less multiple choice. Yeah. Or are you thinking like, are you asking if it's only multiple choice?
No, that's actually, that makes a lot of sense. I guess, do you think that, just your global health, right, test?
Yeah.
It seems to me that the global health test would still box out your like independent creative reading. It still forces you to study only what the material was, figure out how to beat out your friends, to kind of, everyone's going to work to game the system no matter what the test is. So I get that you want your test to be more akin to actual learning and more valuable in and of itself. But does that actually like solve the problem that you see of like focusing learning on one particular thing that the school puts forth as opposed to a student coming in and saying, here's what I want to learn?
Oh, I see. Okay. You're right in that it doesn't solve the problem of it being one thing that isn't like my independent choice. However, I would say that the really nice thing about global health is that it's extremely student-driven. Like we take a survey before and after every single unit. What books do we want to read? What do we think of the reading choices? Stuff like that. So in that sense, it's a little bit different from an average classroom. But another thing is that within the context of this box of, say, water problems in Afghanistan, there's a lot more opportunity where we can choose how far we want to go, how much we want to do, how fast we want to work. And I have brought in a lot of my own reading, in a sense, like, because, I mean, occasionally I would be curious about things having to do, I guess, more with political issues there, but I would bring in outside information and say to my friends that I was working with on my team, like, hey, we should read this and do this. So in that sense, it's a lot more free, but you're right that it isn't like a absolutely democratic, do whatever you want kind of situation. Yes.
What about testing that's less about consequences and like where you get into college and more about like a math test for a teacher to legitimately gauge how her students are doing and work to improve the ones that aren't grasping the material?
Oh yeah, I've definitely seen like where those can be valuable. I can remember like my AP Stats teacher does a lot of like completely non-graded things where we just have to like solve a problem that she sees if we actually manage to do it. But one thing that I see is a lot of times when teachers are, say, trying to do something completely valid, like do a pre-assessment, they'll rely on multiple choice and not really, probably because they don't have the time, not go through like how someone actually solves a problem, for instance. And in that sense, it cuts out the value largely of that, because I mean, that means that you're gauging someone basically on how well they're guessing in some situations. But yeah, I think that it's completely valid to use testing to like understand where students are at, and I just think that we shouldn't attach stakes to that sort of thing, because students are going to go into, say, a pre-assessment completely differently if they think, oh, this is a test that will determine a grade, that will determine all these other things. Yeah. Yep.
Thank you so much for your comments. Your perspective is incredible as a high school student. I'm a high school teacher in New Haven, and so much of what you said resonates with me and what we do in our classroom. I want to ask you about the issues around testing, and specifically with this notion that only children who have mastered the basics are entitled to have an opportunity to self-direct their learning, and that, well, you know, if you look at the kids in New Haven who are underperforming, well, they really do need to, you know, get the basics before they have any sort of choice. How do you respond to that?
I would say that if I wasn't given some choice before I had mastered the basics, I probably would not have mastered the basics. To explain that a little bit more, I've been conditioned to not say I'm bad at math. So I will say I was not the best at, there's no good way to say this, I sucked at math. Like when I was 5 or 6, so I'd be doing mental math with my sister, who was 2 years older than me. And I would just fail to subtract really basic numbers. To this day, subtraction remains like my, okay, I mean, I can subtract, don't worry. But my point is that I did not like math. I came into it with a really bad attitude, and my parents were sort of at a loss. They didn't really know how to make that approachable to me, and they said, like, why don't you like it, and then what can we do to help make it less painful? And I said, well, I really like writing stories. So they said, great, why don't you make up your own word problems? And for me, that ended up being super helpful. I would just go on these super long tangents, like 2-page long story and then question. And somehow that made it that much more interesting to me. And I found that compared to what I'd been doing with my sister and her friends, which was really stressful, let's see who can get the answer in the fastest time and who loses, and I hated mental math because of that. Like it made me look at math in a completely different lens. And to this day, I'm not like I don't have the greatest grades in my math classes, I guess, but like when I talk to my friends who are incredibly good at mathematics, what I see is that they don't like it because they did well on the test. They like it because they managed to find that one thing in it, whether it was, I don't know, fractals or something else that was beautiful to them. And I think that's the same with all subjects. If I had come into writing with an attitude of, oh, you have to write this sentence this way, this essay this way, and not have the choice, I probably wouldn't have become a writer. So yeah, I would say that choice is almost required to love the basics. Any other questions? And okay, so why don't we, first of all, I'd love to hear what your guys' opinions are on alternative measures of assessment. So if we assume that, yes, this is a world in which we must figure out where people stand in some sense, what do you think are the best ways to accomplish that? Whether from a teaching perspective or a student perspective, how would you want people to figure out how you're doing? Yeah.
I love to see collections of work from students. portfolios. Performances are also really important. Doing what you're doing right now is one of the most powerful ways that I've seen my students learn, having to rehearse and prepare to give a presentation. So performances, portfolios allow multiple iterations, multiple drafts of work, and allows us to really get a good picture of what children are able to do, as well as provide the motivation to continue. Because when you get that number back and it's fixed, it really doesn't do a whole lot to move learning along. And there's some really cool models of this around. I've been visiting in New York City. They have a whole performance-based consortium where they've actually gotten an exemption from the Regents exams. And these 22 schools have students that are doing unbelievable work. I've gone down as an external validator to serve as an outside voice and judge, if you will. And it's absolutely mind-blowing what we can do when we set curiosity and students free.
Whoa, that's awesome. I didn't even know that there were some schools that had gotten exemptions. It's really cool.
They don't want you to know. They, not they.
Yeah, I also really like portfolios. And it's funny because, so my school district has a graduation requirement, which is a portfolio, and a lot of, it's kind of the bane of every student because everyone puts off collecting these documents until the very end of senior year, such as yours truly. And I realized though that one thing that made, I think, that people not like portfolios as much was the fact that the majority of it has to be like graded work and required work. But one cool thing is that you can, as long as you write like a longer reflection, you can exchange any of that for a student choice piece. And I realized that my portfolio, which is becoming increasingly student choice driven because I lost so many actual graded pieces of work, I realized that it was something I was really proud of. Like it was documents that were my speeches or presentations from past years, letters that I had written to senators or something like that. So I think that offering more students the chance to do that kind of work is awesome. So portfolios are a great way of assessment, performance-based assessments. I also really like dialoguing with people, having discussions. I know that not all students are outspoken necessarily, but even just like a one-on-one conversation is oftentimes a really good way of understanding where someone is. And another one that I think is really undervalued is asking a student to teach someone else. Because any of you have done tutoring for fellow students know that you know when you don't know something when you try to teach it. Definitely, like, I realized I did not have photosynthesis down in that instance. And I think that also giving students the chance to teach more often within the context of school, whether it's tutoring other students or doing activities within their classroom, or having out-of-school experiences with teaching in local, volunteering perhaps at local schools, that those all can be really, really good methods of them determining their own weaknesses and having a real-world incentive for getting better and learning more. So yeah. Any last questions or comments? Awesome. Oh, yeah.
Well, I'm just curious, in your time as like an advocate for student voice, in your own interactions with like friends in school, just like out of curiosity, like how have like your friends reacted to this, or how have these discussions gone with people who are close to you and not people that you're like? Are your friends on board with what you're saying most of the time? Do people push back?
Yeah, I would say that I get a lot of what I say from just talking to my friends, having these super long-winded conversations at 12 a.m. on Facebook about education, and it always starts inevitably with someone being up really late. I'm kind of a necessity for the full 12 a.m. thing. Being up really late and they're sort of studying for a test, but half-heartedly, and that is always a really good impetus to begin complaining about the education system. And I found that although like 25% of that is, oh my god, I don't want to study right now, and like the majority of it is actually really valid comments on not only the stress that it creates, but also how they wish they could be assessed, some of the things that they've learned in life that they wish were taught in school, that kind of thing, and that's helped inspire a lot of my talks. And like the photo I was looking at was I was stalking some of my friends. So one of the really interesting things, kind of on that point, sorry for another tangent, is that, as I mentioned, people who have done really, really well, who have gotten like 2400s on the SAT, etc., who have benefited from the present system, are still really cognizant of the idea that it does need to change, even if a new system would not benefit them as much. And I think that that is really heartening, and it also points to how messed up our current way of just measuring things and sorting students into boxes at an early age is. So, oh yeah.
So you seem to know exactly what you want to get out of your education. So has that made it easier or harder as you're trying to go to college or do what you want to do next, like in that search?
I'm not sure if I know exactly what I want to get out of my education because it's difficult. I definitely have been at different points throughout high school where I've wanted like more regimented learning, less regimented learning, certain kinds of teachers, other kinds of teachers. But I think that it's made the college search in some sense a little bit difficult because suddenly I'm evaluating schools not just on the things that people usually evaluate, and in fact not really by the things that people usually evaluate, so I wasn't doing a whole lot of looking at like US News and World Report rankings. I was looking at, I remember I went to this U Chicago info session, for example, and I was like, so how is student voice on campus if you say that students are helping drive education decisions? And the admissions officer just kind of stared for a brief moment, because all the other questions were like, how is the food, and what clubs are there and stuff, and she said, well, I mean, we have a student council and stuff like that. So it wasn't, and she didn't really say as to how it influenced the classroom experience or anything, and so I walked away feeling a little bit like, one, I was the weird kid, and two, like, there would be more experiences like that where I went in wanting some really strange things, like more student voice, professors who really valued what they could learn from students as well as what students could learn from them. And so in that sense, it's made it a little bit more confusing. But I think it's also made it more interesting, and I get to find out some really cool things about various schools. So there's that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I know that there's a giant pond out there in the courtyard that maybe a few of you had to step through. I attempted to just leapfrog my way across it. Unfortunately, my childhood lack of skills in leapfrog was definitely not helpful there. And I was thinking of wearing like a formal dress, and then I just looked outside and I was like, it's too cold for that. So I apologize for how informal I am, but I'm really looking forward to this being kind of a two-way discussion, much as I hope education is more of a two-way discussion in the future. That was a terrible segue. And, this is going to be talking about a lot of different things. Specifically, I'm hoping to provide a student voice in education. I know that many of you are students in education studies, but I'm a student in high school, and I think that that helps shed a lot of light on what students in public schools who are not just in high school, but also middle school and elementary school are going through when it comes to testing culture, which is one of the main focuses of my talk today. Okay, that was a slightly awkward word there.